The system produces a consistent pattern. Vendor approvals move quickly through layers of management. Projects begin without visible friction, but ownership of decisions is unclear once outcomes are tested. A common explanation points to operational pressure. Managers are assumed to be overloaded, optimizing for speed to keep workflows moving. Faster approval is seen as a trade-off against deeper evaluation, producing occasional gaps in accountability. But this explanation fails to account for persistence. Even when failures surface and consequences become visible, the same approval behavior repeats. The system does not revert to stricter review, indicating that workload alone does not explain the pattern. The structure of approval reveals a different mechanism. Approval decisions are logged and visible, but responsibility is distributed across roles and checkpoints. The incentive favors completing approval actions while diffusing accountability for their outcomes. Managers adapt by anchoring decisions to formal criteria. Instead of evaluating ownership, they align approvals with documented requirements. This shifts the decision from personal accountability to procedural compliance. Once criteria become the reference point, rejecting a vendor requires additional justification. Approving within criteria becomes the lower risk action. The system begins to favor approvals that are defensible rather than decisions that are owned. This creates a divergence between signal and responsibility. Approval acts as a visible signal of action taken, while ownership becomes less observable. The system rewards the signal without requiring full alignment with accountability. As approvals accumulate, responsibility becomes increasingly fragmented. Multiple actors participate in the approval chain, each contributing a small part of the decision. No single point retains full exposure to the outcome. This fragmentation alters how decisions are made. Each actor optimizes for passing their checkpoint with minimal friction. The collective effect reduces the likelihood of deep evaluation at any single stage. Even when a decision leads to failure, attribution is delayed and distributed. Blame is traced across the chain rather than assigned to a specific decision point. This reduces immediate penalty for any individual actor. The system begins to stabilize around throughput. Speed of approval becomes the primary measurable outcome. Accountability becomes a secondary and less observable dimension. A contrast emerges between visibility and consequence. Approvals are tracked in real time, but responsibility only becomes visible after failure. This timing gap shifts focus toward actions with immediate recognition. Actors respond to this timing mismatch. They prioritize actions that produce immediate completion signals. Delayed consequences carry less weight in decision-making. Over time, the approval process becomes standardized around criteria compliance. Evaluation depth decreases as long as formal conditions are met. The system reduces variability, but also reduces ownership. Attempts to tighten oversight often reinforce the same structure. Additional criteria layers increase documentation, but do not centralize responsibility. The system becomes more complex without restoring ownership. This creates a feedback loop between process and behavior. More rules generate more criteria shielding, which further diffuses responsibility. The system amplifies approval activity without strengthening accountability. A second contrast appears between decision authority and outcome exposure. Managers retain the authority to approve, but do not carry full exposure to consequences. This separation reshapes how authority is exercised. Decisions become calibrated to minimize personal exposure rather than maximize outcome quality. Approval within criteria becomes the safest strategy. Ownership is implicitly transferred to the system itself. As more actors rely on this pattern, deviation becomes costly. Rejecting within criteria requires justification that increases individual exposure. Conformity to approval norms becomes the dominant strategy. The system reorganizes around predictable approval behavior. Vendors learn to meet criteria thresholds rather than demonstrate deeper value. The interaction between manager and vendor aligns around approval conditions. This alignment reinforces the original mechanism. Criteria compliance becomes sufficient for progression through the system. Evaluation shifts from substance to alignment with formal signals. Responsibility continues to diffuse across the structure. No mechanism recenters accountability at a single decision point. The system sustains high throughput without consolidating ownership. The equilibrium emerges as approval without ownership. Decisions are made, recorded, and progressed through the system efficiently. Accountability remains dispersed, stabilizing a structure where approval persists without concentrated responsibility. The timing gap between approval and consequence begins to accumulate structural weight. Approvals are completed in short cycles, while failures surface only after vendors are already integrated. This creates a persistent mismatch where throughput is evaluated immediately, but accountability is evaluated later. As this gap widens, the system adjusts what it treats as relevant information. Immediate approval metrics remain visible and actionable, while delayed failure signals become harder to trace back to specific decisions. Decision-making shifts further toward signals that can be acted on in real time. Information about responsibility becomes increasingly fragmented. Each approval checkpoint records compliance with criteria, but does not capture full decision context. When outcomes degrade, the system lacks a single traceable path of ownership. This fragmentation reinforces the original behavior. Since no actor can fully reconstruct responsibility, no actor can be directly exposed. The absence of clear attribution reduces the corrective pressure on future approvals. As more approvals pass through this structure, scaling amplifies the pattern. The volume of decisions increases faster than the system's ability to connect outcomes to specific approvals. Responsibility diffusion becomes not only a feature, but a necessity for maintaining throughput. Vendors adapt to this environment by aligning with visible criteria. Meeting documented requirements becomes sufficient to pass through approval layers. Deeper evaluation becomes less relevant as long as formal signals are satisfied. This creates a feedback loop between approval criteria and vendor behavior. Criteria define what is rewarded, and vendors optimize to meet those signals. The system increasingly selects for alignment with criteria rather than alignment with outcomes. As alignment with criteria becomes dominant, deviations become more costly. Rejecting a compliant vendor requires justification that cannot be easily supported by the existing information structure. Approval becomes the path of least resistance under constrained visibility. Over time, the approval system accumulates decisions that are individually defensible but collectively opaque. Each decision can be justified within its local context, yet the system cannot evaluate aggregate responsibility. This limits the system's ability to recalibrate based on outcomes. Attempts to trace failures introduce additional documentation rather than structural change. More records are created, but they mirror the same fragmented structure of responsibility. The system increases informational volume without improving attribution clarity. This creates a secondary distortion in evaluation. Success continues to be measured through approval throughput, while failure remains distributed and delayed. The system becomes more confident in its signals without improving its connection to outcomes. As confidence in approval signals increases, reliance on criteria deepens. Managers depend more heavily on documented compliance to justify decisions. The system narrows acceptable decision pathways to those that align with criteria shielding. This narrowing effect reduces variability in decision-making. Most approvals follow similar patterns of justification, reinforcing consistency in process. At the same time, it reduces the system's capacity to detect misalignment with outcomes. A reinforcing loop emerges between scale and diffusion. Higher volume increases the need for distributed responsibility, and distributed responsibility enables higher volume. The system locks into a state where both factors sustain each other. Within this loop, corrective feedback becomes structurally delayed. By the time failure signals emerge, the approval context has already shifted forward. Decisions are evaluated in a different temporal frame than the one in which they were made. This temporal displacement weakens the impact of negative outcomes. Actors cannot easily connect consequences to their own past decisions. Future approvals remain guided by current criteria rather than past outcomes. At this stage, the system appears stable, but internally misaligned. Approval processes function smoothly, and throughput remains consistent. However, the connection between decision and responsibility continues to weaken. The system now operates under a persistent condition of approval without ownership. Decisions are continuously made and recorded, but accountability remains structurally dispersed. This condition reinforces itself as both the operational norm and the path of least resistance. The system no longer rewards careful evaluation as a primary behavior. It rewards the ability to complete approvals within visible criteria while maintaining procedural defensibility. Actions that align with criteria continue to move forward regardless of how closely they connect to outcomes. At the same time, what the system ignores becomes clearer. Ownership of decisions is not tracked in real time and does not influence immediate progression. Decisions without clear accountability continue to pass as long as they satisfy observable requirements. Penalties shift away from decision quality and toward deviation from process. Rejecting or delaying within criteria creates exposure that is immediate and traceable. Approval becomes the safer action because it aligns with what the system can observe and evaluate. This redefines how behavior stabilizes across actors. Managers no longer optimize for outcome ownership, but for alignment with criteria that distribute responsibility. The system narrows acceptable actions to those that preserve approval flow without concentrating accountability. The equilibrium holds because each actor responds to the same structure. Faster approvals remain rewarded, while delayed consequences remain dispersed and disconnected. The system continues to produce approval without ownership, not by design, but because the incentives make it the stable outcome.